Welcome to Lead Up Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Harbour. We're really excited. We're starting off in 2026 talking about all things leadership like we always do, really helping you, the leader, understand more about the strategy and mindsets that it takes to be an elite leader, just become an exceptional leader. I'm really thrilled today to revisit with Amer Kazi, who has been a guest on the podcast before. Amer wrote a book called Humbitious, and we talked about that in episode 326 back in 2023. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that book, I'm going to give Amer a chance to talk about that in just a minute. But you can also go back and listen to episode 326 on the Lead Up podcast. And he's with us today because he's written a new book. And Amer is a theorist, a practitioner, a teacher, a coach, a leader in his own right. He's a professor at Trinity University down in Texas, but he's written a new book called The Positive Intent Mindset. I'm really excited. I just got a copy of the book yesterday, so I haven't had time to read it, but I have thumbed through it enough to know that I can't wait to dive deeper because I know there's some things that I'm going to need to learn myself and apply in my own leadership. So, Amer, thanks for saying yes. Thanks for what you do, first of all, to help leaders grow. Thanks for saying yes to come back and be a guest on the Lead Up podcast, and welcome.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate the opportunity, and it's great to be back on this great podcast. I had a lot of fun the first time around, and I'm looking forward to today.
Yeah, you're a great conversationalist, which is always fun for me as a podcaster to do interviews. I've now probably interviewed over 20,000 people in my life, Amer, not just on the podcast, but in a previous life, I was a headhunter, so I recruited healthcare executives and helped companies hire people. And I've done tens of thousands, probably over 20,000 interviews of leaders. And now, this is episode 469 on the podcast. So we've interviewed a lot of leaders on our Lead Up podcast. I also used to co-host a John Maxwell leadership podcast where we interviewed a lot of leaders there as well. Before we jump into talking about your new book, though, I want to just give you a moment to talk about the original podcast we did together and the book you wrote, Humbitious. Kind of what was the thesis behind that, and why leaders should go back and listen to that previous conversation and maybe pick up a copy of that book too.
Absolutely. Yeah, when we talked about Humbitious a few years ago, we talked about the message being that in leadership, humility is not a weakness. It's actually a strength, and it can be a superpower when combined with ambition. So when we're leading through times of change and times of uncertainty, like all industries are in right now, the research shows that the best leaders are those that elevate with ambition and they connect with humility. So ambition allows leaders, allows teams, allows organizations to reach for the stars, and humility makes sure that their feet stay grounded while they're reaching for the stars. So that was the main message from that book.
Yeah, I love that. And look, the reality is a lot of leaders need to learn that, right? I know in my own life, I've been self-employed for 20 years now this year, very ambitious, always been goal-driven. What's next? What's next? What's next? And I still have that mindset. It took me a long time to learn the humility piece, though, Amer, and I had to really go to work on that because I felt like I had something to prove. I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth, so I was always trying to get away from where I'd come from and be something better. And with that comes a lot of maybe a chip on my shoulder or maybe some arrogance and not really that humility. And I think I've done a pretty good job the last 15, 20 years of developing that humility, but also maintaining that ambition to really serve the world and help people. So I just want to recommend listeners, if you're listening today, go get the book, no matter where you are. Maybe you're humble, maybe you're the most humble leader that you know. You can still learn something from that book. You can also listen to that previous episode with Amer and learn something from him there. Okay, Amer, let's jump in.
What I would say here, Mark, just to follow up on your point, from conversations with many leaders over the last 3 years talking about the ambitious concept, it's many of them kind of shared similar sentiments to what you shared, where one of the two traits came more naturally to them and then the other one was a muscle that they had to develop. So you talked about, ambition coming naturally to you, and you had to work on the humility. Many leaders had that. Others said, no, actually, I have the humility. I'm very humble. I need to work on the drive. I need to work on the assertiveness. I need to work on the courage to make decisions under conditions of uncertainty. So, we all have something that comes naturally to us and other traits that we have to work on and develop and work that muscle.
Oh, I love that. We're going to get to your other book, but now you created another question for me, right? There's an old saying that leaders are born. And I've never been a fan of that, right? Because I'm a believer that leaders are developed. We're all birthed, but the best leaders I know have been developed. I know a lot of, maybe even you, I know a lot of people from my past, they were, oh, that guy's just a natural born leader, or that gal's a natural born leader. But they never go any further than that, right? They reach their capacity and they don't continue to grow. And it's about developing that muscle, as you said. I love that the idea, the word imagery of developing the muscle. There are lots of muscles in leadership we need to develop, but you've done a ton of research. You've worked with hundreds and hundreds of leaders, I'm sure. Talk about the difference in like being a born leader versus being a leader who develops into the leader they need to become.
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. And I kind of agree with your view on that, in that you may have some natural talents. Absolutely. People come in with natural talents, be it intelligence, be it aspects of their personality or their emotional intelligence. But that's only going to take you that far, right? You're going to get to a stage in your career where everyone else is naturally talented. Everyone else is bringing talent to the table. But it's those leaders that continue to work on themselves, continue to build whatever muscles they're lacking in the field of leadership, and that continue to learn and grow. These are the leaders that are going to differentiate themselves from other people. I like the muscle analogy because it also reminds us that if you don't work that muscle, it's going to atrophy, right? It is going to become much weaker, and it's not going to be something that you can use. So, that's at the end of the day, that's what the premise of coaching is based on, right? If we didn't believe that people can learn and improve, if we thought that people can just rely on their natural talents, then there wouldn't be any need for coaches working with leaders and helping them, identify their blind spots and working on their areas for improvement or their weaknesses.
Yeah, so important. I've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars on myself over the years in coaching and development, either training, meetings, learning from others, or coaching, just getting coached. And I coach lots of leaders every year. It's those ones that are coachable, that grow, right? I know for me, Amir, I wasn't a great student growing up. I often tell people that the first book I ever read, I was 23 years old. I had graduated high school. I had been to college for 4 years. Notice I didn't say I graduated from college after 4 years. It took me another 4 years to graduate. I was kind of a slow developer in that regard. But I joined the Army when I was 22, and I had a leader who took a keen interest in me while I was in the Army, a fantastic leader, and began mentoring me and working to develop he saw the ambition, right? But he knew, he said, Mike, you got a lot of drive, you got a lot of ability, but we've got to learn to harness some of that and teach you some things about leadership. And he gave me 2 books, Amir. The first one, and you'll know, is 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I mentioned that a lot. I still reference it. It's the first book I ever read from cover to cover. And then he gave me a book called Developing the Leader Within You by John Maxwell. And that's where I fell in love with this idea of growing. And so since then, I've written a few books, believe it or not, and I've read hundreds and hundreds of books, and still do, because I want to keep sharpening that saw, as Stephen Covey said, right? And that's what coaching does. I want to let you talk about coaching for just a minute, because I know you're a coach. What's the importance of coaching and continuing to sharpen that saw and not getting comfortable or complacent in our growth as a leader? And why is that so important today? I think it's more important today than it's ever been.
Yeah. So naturally, I'm I'm a great believer in coaching. I myself and is an executive coach, but I myself have been coached by others as well. I have sought out coaching by others because we all need it. I see coaching as the gift that you give to yourself as a leader, and hopefully it's a gift that your organization can give to you as well. Sometimes I have leaders coming to me and saying, I have some money for development, right? I have some funds in the organization for professional development. What should I use that money on? Should I go and get another certification? Should I get, another attend another online course? And I tell them, listen, these obviously are going to be valuable to you, but in my opinion, the most valuable thing you can do for yourself as a leader is to get coaching from a qualified coach, from someone who has the expertise, who knows what they're doing, because coaching is just going to open up your eyes to things that you haven't been thinking about before. It's going to point out those blind spots. Unfortunately, in leadership, we don't get a lot of good feedback. No matter how great of a leader you are and how open you are and how approachable you are, you're not having people every day coming to you and saying, hey, can I give you some feedback? Can I offer this advice? It's very, few and far in between. And that's why leaders need the coaching to realize what these blind spots are and to see different perspectives, to learn new techniques, new paradigms, new mental models of looking at the world. And the value of coaching, in my opinion, is building the intentionality in the coaching, right?
Yeah.
Most leaders are showing up every day on cruise control because we're busy, because the world is so complex, because there are so many fires to put out and there's so much uncertainty. And as a result, there's not a lot of intentionality, not a lot of choice, not a lot of awareness in how I'm showing up as a leader. And I see the role of coaching in building some of that intentionality for leaders.
Yeah, that's so good. You reminded me of something I heard Quint Studer say one time when you were talking about the feedback. He said, no, nobody's walking around saying, hey, let me tell you how great a job you're doing, right? But they will certainly show up and tell you when you're missing the mark. But feedback is both, right? It's both positive and forward thinking, and it's reflective and course correcting, right? And some of that advisory and coaching and getting people to think about things differently. And I think to be a great leader, to be a great coach, requires a positive mindset. And you just happen to write a book on the positive intent mindset. And let's dive into that a little bit right now. But I want to just ask you a question. Trust, we know this. I mean, we don't have to go very far. Trust is at an all-time low in the world today, right? But between people and people in leadership or just anything out there that's in the world. And so great leadership, positive intent leadership will help us close that gap. But Amir's going to talk to us about that a little bit. But here's the first question I want to ask you. How does this explain to us what positive intent means, and how does the concept of positive intent connect to the research around compassion that you had a couple of folks write a forward around compassionomics? I'll let you talk about them in just a minute. But how does the concept of assuming positive intent connect to the research on compassion?
Yeah, for sure. So this idea for the positive intent mindset book, this came from my own experiences, just growing up, but also from the stories and the cases that I heard from the leaders that I work with. And what I noticed is that as human beings and as leaders, when we notice someone acting in a way that we can't explain, or maybe doing something that we deem to be wrong, or we think that they have wronged us or said something, that we didn't like, our default setting is to assume that they have negative intent, right? We start thinking to ourselves, what's wrong with that person? Why do they want to sabotage my plan? There must be something wrong with them. They must be mean. They must be scheming. There needs to be some negative intent behind what they did or what they said. And what I've noticed is that this type of thinking then leads to reduced trust.
Mm.
It decreases collaboration. And most importantly, it causes people to be miserable. Just think of the extent of stewing that we fall into when we have that mindset, right? Someone says something in a meeting, or you overhear, a comment about yourself, and then you just go home and you think about it over and over and over, and you start making up stories, you start creating narratives in your mind, and all of that creates misery. You're not happy. And guess what? You go back the following day and you just go and confront them. You go all guns blazing. Maybe you lose control, you lose your temper, and you're being aggressive with them. And my suggestion is, what if we replace that default setting with a different mindset? And that mindset is to start from the starting point of, what if they're trying their best, right? What if they have a reason? So it's a positive intent mindset in terms of assuming that they may have a positive intention, or at least a neutral intention, and give them the benefit of the doubt and go check with them in a non-confrontational way, in a non-emotional way. So that's the basic premise of the positive intent mindset. Now, the connection to compassion and the research on compassion, I also work in healthcare, do a lot of work in healthcare, as you have done, and you continue to do. And I got the great pleasure of meeting the authors of a great book called Compassionomics, and then they wrote another book after that called The Wonder Drug. And they're two physician leaders that work at Cooper Health in New Jersey. And we started talking about their research on compassion, which shows that compassion is absolutely essential for all aspects of healthcare, whether it's within healthcare teams or between providers and patients, and all the benefits that the research shows for compassion. And we compared notes, and we saw there was a lot of overlap between that and the positive intent mindset, because a big part of the positive intent mindset is try to put yourself in the shoes of the other, right? To try to feel empathy toward them, try to feel compassion towards them. And those conversations led us then for me to invite them to write the foreword of the book, which, the readers can see, if once they get the book. And they did a great job of showing that what we're looking for is not just some empty, touchy-feely stuff, but rather we're looking for evidence-based traits and behaviors and leadership that really help us bridge those gaps in trust and those gaps in collaboration.
That's good. You remind me of a couple things. Number one, you mentioned about people hearing something and then going home and stewing about it, which a lot of people do. But I also think what happens, and what is very dangerous, is people hear something in a meeting and they sit and stew on it during the meeting, and they never hear anything else that's going on in the meeting, right? And so what happens a lot of times, there's an old quote: the most dangerous thing about communication is to have the illusion that it actually happened, right? And so if someone's sitting and stewing over something they heard in the meeting that bothered them, they're not hearing the communication that's going on and the other things that may be important. So this is an important skill that you're teaching here. I believe it's a skill that people have to learn, right? To not be offended, to not look at why did this person say this that way, but to look past that. You also reminded me of a story, and I'm sure you've heard it, Amer, but I know a story about a dad walks onto the subway with his kids, and his kids are running crazy, causing all kinds of havoc on the subway. And then finally someone says to the dad, "Hey, can you get your kids under control?" And the dad says, "Oh yeah, I'm sorry about that. Their mother just died. We just left the hospital." We never know. What you're teaching is we never know what's going on in someone else's life, right? So having that positive intent and that compassion allows us to maybe step in and wonder, at least wonder, be curious. I call it curiosity leadership. Be curious about what's going on. So it's an important skill that Amer is talking about here in his book. We need to get a copy of his book so we can learn more about that. I want to move on, Amer, because you say it's our choice. You write about this in the chapter. You share a story of Hunter and Tina. What key lesson does it teach about the choices we make in interpreting others' actions.
Yeah. So very briefly, the story of Hunter and Tina told to me by my colleague Hunter, who was leading a team at the time. And they had a vacancy on the team and they had a big project coming up. So Hunter was very happy that he was able to bring in Tina, who worked for another team whose offices were adjacent to Hunter's team. So he had an agreement with her manager that she's going to spend another 2 weeks with her old team, and then once that transition period was over, they're going to bring her over to his team. So the transition period is over. Hunter is walking through the hallway, and he looks through the glass wall conference room of the other team, and he sees that Tina is still there with her old team having a meeting. So he's a little bit annoyed by it, but he waits a little bit. He calls the manager after an hour, and the manager says, yeah, I'm sorry, she was just back one last time to tie up some loose ends. She's all yours starting from this afternoon. So Hunter is like, all right, no big deal. A week later, Hunter and his team are working on their big launch. He's very stressed out. Monday morning, he walks again through the hallway and he sees Tina there, still sitting with her old team, having another meeting with them. Now, at that moment, he just loses it, right? He's very stressed out. He's under pressure. And there she is chit-chatting with her old team. So he just, barges into the room, starts yelling and screaming, "What do you think you're doing? Why are you here?" And Tina, the other team, the other manager are just stunned. They look at him and he's like, "What are you doing?" And once he stops yelling, they explain to him that actually Tina was there because he's trying to enlist the help of her old team in helping Hunter and his team with the launch of the new project. So he thought that she didn't care. Actually, she was trying her best to help him and his new project. And the question then that poses is, can this relationship recover, right?
Yeah.
That trust that is supposed to be present between an employee and their team leader is shattered through that loss of control, through that loss of temper, and because Hunter assumed negative intent on her part and did not check. He just went in without checking, right? You were talking about curious leadership a couple of minutes ago. There was no curious there. He was all furious, right? And
I
that's
love
why
it.
one of the advices we give leaders is don't be furious, be curious, right? Just take a moment, pause a little bit, think a little bit, and then check. And the check is very important, right? With this approach is not the naive approach, Mike. This is not about let people get away with murder. This is not about let people get away with poor performance, with bad actions, bad behaviors. No, the starting point is assuming positive intent provisionally, and then you go check with them, and then you hold them accountable for their actions.
Yeah, that's so good. I hate to ask if Hunter survived that, because look, that's a lack of emotional IQ right there, right? And unfortunately, there are leaders that do that. I've probably made a few mistakes. Maybe not that bad, but I've made some mistakes in my emotional awareness for sure. But it's a great example because those things happen every day. I just had a conversation with a chief nursing officer today, Amir, about an employee similar to Hunter that you just described that has, lacks some of that emotional awareness and doesn't necessarily declare positive intent around others and gets real abrasive or real aggressive in that. So it is a skill that certainly still needs to be learned today. Great example. It leads nicely into what I want to ask you about next, which is in chapter 2. You talk about why all the negativity. Use a personal anecdote in there about coffee delivery to one of your workshops. So what are the main reasons we typically default to negative assumptions in your findings?
Yeah, there's some external reasons and there are some internal reasons for why our default is to assume negative intent. Starting with the external reasons, we live right now in a world where we are bombarded by negative news, negative events, people doing wrong things, right? You remember the couple from the Coldplay concert, right?
Oh, yeah.
The executive who was cheating on his wife with one of his executives. There was what people call baseball Karen, right? That the lady at the baseball game that just snatched a baseball from a little boy, right? We
Yes.
see
Yeah.
kind of things like every single day. These are available in our palms on our phones every single day. So social media, cable news, all of these negative events around us, we start thinking that everyone out there is a liar, everyone is a cheater, everyone is out there to get us.
Yeah.
So that colors the way that we see the world. We become very fearful. We become very insecure about the outside world. So these are the external reasons that lead us to assume negative intent. But there are some internal reasons as well. One of them is what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error. And simply explained, the fundamental attribution error is that we tend to judge others by their actions, but we judge ourselves by our intentions.
Mm-hmm.
So you see someone doing something wrong, you don't stop to ask, why are they doing this? You just judge them right away. But if I'm doing something wrong, well, I have the right intentions. It's just, I found myself in these tough situations and I have to act this way. So we have those internal biases that predispose us to act in that way. Now, these biases in the past maybe have protected us, right? If we go back to evolution, if you were, if our ancestors, the cave people, were walking out in the savannah and, they saw another person or another creature that they haven't seen before, they had to assume negative intent. That was the right thing to do because you protected your life that way.
Yeah.
But right now in our professional relationships and our personal relationships, we don't have that level of threat anymore. And yet we continue to assume negative intent to protect ourselves. So these are some of the reasons why that is the default setting. And that's why assuming positive intent sounds simple, but it's actually very hard to do because we are going to be going against our nature with that.
That's so good. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to say, as you and I record this, it's January the 8th of 2026, Amer, and I deleted all the social media apps off of my phone except for LinkedIn, because I use LinkedIn for work. It's typically mostly positive work related stuff, right? It's not, I mean, once in a while you'll see some stuff on there, but I just kind of breeze through it. But any of the other apps, I mean, unless you're intentional about what you look at and what you block, you're constantly fed, as you said, with the negativity. And then we label everybody, oh, they're all bad, right? Or they all mean to do that. And look, you and I are, I'm probably a little bit older than you, but we're of the same generation. We didn't grow up that way, right? And this 24/7 news and access to all the negativity it's changed our psyches, right? Our minds, our subconscious minds. And we're, we got a lot of work to do in that regard. I don't know what the answers are other than, for me, I deleted them off my phone, so I'm not even tempted to go there and look. And
Oh, I applaud you for that, Mike. And I've actually done something a little bit similar with following the news, right?
yeah,
Yes, you need to be informed. You need to know what's happening in the country, what's happening in the world, but not following every single breaking news, every single thing that's happening minute by minute. That takes a toll on our psyche and our mental health, and our brains are not equipped to that. They're not equipped to deal with that. I mean, and think of this example. Think of the average person, let's say back in the 1600s, right?
mm-hmm.
So back in the 1600s, the world actually was a much more dangerous place than it is right now. But people didn't hear about it all the time. The only time you heard about bad things happening were through word of mouth. So the average person probably heard about, cheating and lying and killing and all of the bad things in the world, but they heard about very limited instances of that in their lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
Think about us today. We can hear about hundreds of examples of those things happening before you've even had your morning coffee. On your phone, you have access to all of that. And our brains are not equipped for that. So one of the things I talk about in the book, and this is documented by research, is that in fact, the world right now is a much safer place than it used to be in the past. But because of social media and because of cable news, we think that it's way more dangerous, it's way more unsafe. And that's why we protect ourselves and we assume negative intent.
Yeah, society's allowed news media and social media to hijack our thinking, right, and do our thinking for us, unfortunately, and we gotta take that back for sure. And again, we could spend it all day probably talking about those things, but I want to make sure we continue forward in this conversation. Um, the small actions matter, right? Small actions, big impact. Optimism plays a huge role too. I'm a optimistic guy. I'm very hopeful. I have a lot of hope for the future and what's going to happen. And despite the negative stuff that we talked about, but you write about realistic optimism, right? And you reference Martin Seligman's work, who I'm a fan of,
Mm-hmm.
certainly. How does, he's talked a lot about gratitude and those kind of things, and maybe you get into that in some of your book, but how does this mindset of assuming positive intent, how does that support positive intent without us being naive, as you kind of mentioned a minute ago?
Yeah, yeah. And that's why we talk about realistic optimism here, right? It's not naive optimism. It's not just, thinking, oh, everyone means well. No, this concept is related to what is the story that we tell ourselves after someone does something annoying or appears to be wronging us, right? And
Mhm.
and Seligman talks about this idea of the explanatory style. How do we explain the world in our hearts? And when he talks about explanatory style, he talks about three specific things. He talks about permanence, he talks about pervasiveness, and he talks about personalization. So let's take an example. Let's say someone did something wrong at work, all right? Or you interpreted them to be doing something wrong. The pessimistic interpretation of that is first, this is how they're always going to be. So that's the permanence of it. And then you interpret that behavior as, well, this is going to make everything so bad. So that's the pervasiveness of the explanation. And finally, and most importantly, is the personalization of the behavior. So you start thinking, well, they did this because they have something wrong in their personality, because they have bad intentions. And the realistic optimism is about changing that thinking and going from permanence to temporary and thinking, well, yeah, they did something wrong, but it's not always going to be like this. Or it's one problem. It doesn't make everything bad. You try to compartmentalize it and put it in a box. And finally, perhaps more importantly, is to move away from the personalization, to move away from thinking there must be something wrong with them, to saying they must be in a situation that caused them to act this way. Maybe they are under a lot of pressure. Maybe something is going on at home. Kind of back to your dad on the subway story. Maybe there is a reason why someone is acting the way that they're acting. So that concept of realistic optimism, again, it's a starting point. It's a provisional explanation, and then you go and check with the other person and ask them what is actually going on.
That's so good. I love that. I'm glad that there were people in my life that didn't assign permanence to me, right? Because as I alluded to it, I grew up in a violent, abusive, dysfunctional home as a kid, and therefore I was violent and dysfunctional early in my life. There were probably teachers that were glad to see me go, right, and get out of the classroom. But what's funny, it's funny today. I'm a completely different individual today than I was growing up because I've done the work. I've rebuilt, transformed myself. But you can go home today where I grew up, and you're assigned to permanence by those people who knew you then, right? And I think what you're teaching here is that if we don't grow, if we don't learn some things about other people, we will unintentionally a bias, maybe, an unconscious bias. We'll have a bias against people because, oh, that's the way they were 40 years ago. They're
Yeah.
still that way today, potentially. Would you like to add more to that?
No, I think you definitely hit the nail on the head, and the permanence is really interesting because then you assign that not just to what that person, but you assign it to people who look or act or are similar to that person. For
Mm,
example, let's say early in my career, I had a bad experience with a tall accountant, right?
mm,
Every time I'm gonna work with a tall accountant, I'm gonna think this person maybe up to something, right? This person is hiding. This person has an agenda. So we bring that baggage, not just when we're dealing with the same person, when we're dealing with people who belong to the same group as that person. And that's where things become even more problematic. So
Mm.
you're absolutely right that the permanence aspect of it is very important. And then I think the personalization is also so key. You know, another aspect of the fundamental attribution theory that I talked about earlier is that so often when we see someone acting in a way that we don't agree with, we think it's due to their personality.
Mm.
And we rarely think that it's due to the environment in which they operate.
Yeah.
Many times, you're going to see that the reason people act the way they act is not due to their person, but rather due to the situation that they found themselves in. There's a
Yeah.
great psychology book that I read early on in my career. It's called The Person and the Situation. And it goes to great lengths to show the research that validates this idea that most of the time our behavior is a function of the environment or the situation that we find ourselves in rather than our own personal characteristics.
Yeah. I can validate all of that research just from my own life history, right? I love that. It's great. It's also a great segue into chapter 10, where you talk about forgiveness. So how can leaders practice true forgiveness when someone's has intentionally wronged them, without holding on to resentment? I think this is key for leaders to be able to move on and lead at a high level. So let's speak into that and what you've shared in your book.
Yeah, you know, this idea of talking about forgiveness within the context of positive intent came to me when I was working with a leader, and you know, she was telling me about a previous boss that she had, and that previous boss was a very toxic person. You know, talked down to her, yelled and screamed, just had unrealistic expectations in terms of performance and work demands and all of that, and it was so visible how much in pain she was talking about that boss. And I finally stopped her and I asked her, I said, "How long ago did you work for this person?" And she said, 18 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, I was shocked. I'm like, 18 years ago, and he's still talking about it now, like it happened yesterday. It is still occupying a lot of headspace for her, and it's still causing her pain every single day.
Mm.
And that's where the idea of forgiveness came in that at some point in time, we need to forgive, but it's not forgiveness in the way that we normally think about it. So when I introduced the concept of forgiveness to her, she said, "No, I don't want to forgive him. You know, I don't want to reconcile with him." I'm like, no one is talking about reconciliation. We're talking about forgiving for you, not for him, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about you moving on, you not feeling the resentment, right? You know that saying about resentment being, you know, like drinking a poison and hoping that the other person dies.
Yeah.
You're drinking the poison, but you're hoping that the other person, you know, dies. So we talked about ways that she can move on from that
Mm.
for her own good so that she doesn't think about that person anymore, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that I talk about in the book, and it's a well-known saying, it, you know, it goes like this. It says, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional,
Mm.
right?
So good.
In this world that we live in, we're going to have pain. We're going to deal with people that cause us pain, and that's inevitable. But what we do with that and how we deal with it in the long run, and whether we let it affect us and have us suffer, that's our own option. And that's where that concept of forgiveness comes from. So it's a little bit different from how we typically think about forgiveness as reconciling with the other person or talking to them. No, this is not about the other person. This is about us.
Yeah. That's so good. I love it. And it's vital as individuals, just human beings. You know, we talk about leaders here on the Lead Up podcast, and there's so many leaders carrying resentment or, you know, paying forward, right? And then that bleeds out into their trust and communication with other people. I know for me, Amer, you know, I grew up in a very violent, abusive, physically, mentally, emotionally abusive home. And I had to do the work of forgiveness, right? Because I carried a lot of anger into my adult life. I mean, I was in my late 20s and early 30s. I'm 55 now. I was in my early 30s before I started doing that work. And man, it changed everything in the way I led people, the compassion I began to have for people. And there's a lot of life events in there that, having kids was one of those, right? I didn't want to raise my kids in an environment that I grew up in. I didn't have my first child until I was almost 31. Thank goodness, because I wasn't ready before then. But I think it's so important. And listeners, here's what we want you to hear. And first of all, go get a copy of Amir's book, Positive Intent Mindset. Learn these things. But here's what we want you to hear. Everything that you're carrying, positive, hopefully positive, but also negative, it bleeds out into the way you lead other people. You can't hide it. And so if you have trust issues, if you have anger issues, if you have, being offended issues, whatever those things are, it's going to bleed out into your leadership and create challenges for you. And I think that's what Amir is talking to us about in this book. And I want to challenge you to go out, get a copy of the book, hire a coach, do the work that needs to be done so that you can grow as a leader. The world is desperately screaming for leadership right now. And I've been saying that for 10 years, Amir. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like it's gotten a whole lot better, but it's desperately screaming for leadership, and we need leaders to grow and do the work that Amir's talked about. Amir, I'll give you a few seconds to any closing thoughts that you want to leave our leaders, listeners with that they need to hear from you.
No, I just want to say, thank you for this great opportunity. And while it seems like nothing has happened in the last 10 years, I think your podcast and your thought leadership is definitely having a positive impact on the world. I know I've greatly enjoyed listening to the podcast, and I know that the leaders and the listeners greatly benefit from hearing your perspective on that. So thank you for doing what you're doing. I know, before we started, you were telling me about how many episodes you've had and how many years you've been doing that. So keep up the good work.
Yeah, thanks so much. Tell our listeners where they can learn more about you, get a copy of Ambitious, get a copy of the Positive Intent Mindset book as well.
Absolutely. So people can connect with me on LinkedIn, Amer Kaisi, Amer, last name Kaissi. Last time I checked, there was only one of me on LinkedIn, so it's easy to find. My website, it's amerkaisi.com, just one word, amerkaissi.com. And then to find the books, they're available online, wherever you buy your books online. So it's pretty easy to get them. They're all available in hard copies on Kindle as well as an audiobook. So I narrated the book myself as well on audiobook. So if you're into that, you can definitely listen to it on your commute to work.
Right on. It's definitely made my 2026 reading list. It's going to move near the top because I know I need to learn some of what you shared deeply today. Amir, thank you for the work that you do, the impact that you make, the message that you shared today. Just thanks for being a great guest on the Lead Up Podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Mike.